The cowboy gave the Black Widow an empty cabin. But what she found, waiting behind that door, wasn't what anyone expected. "Don't take another step," Eleanor Brooks whispered, standing in front of the old cabin door as the wind shook the pine trees around her. A stranger from her past had arrived, papers in his hand and accusations on his lips, while the cowboy who offered her this place stood silently nearby. But why was he the only man who never asked her to prove who she was? Stay with us and discover the truth behind Eleanor's cabin. The first thing Eleanor Brooks noticed about Red Hollow was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that followed a person. Her boots touched the dusty wooden walkway outside the small rental office on the edge of town. A cold Colorado wind moved through the street, carrying the smell of horse sweat, coal smoke, and dry mountain air from the distant Sangre de Cristo range. Eleanor placed her worn leather suitcase beside her feet and reached into her coat pocket. "I have enough for a month," she said quietly. The man behind the desk counted the coins without looking at her face. He was a thin fellow with silver glasses and a habit of tapping his fingers whenever he wanted a conversation to end. Then he looked up. "Mrs. Brooks?" Eleanor nodded. The man's expression changed. Not anger, not kindness, something in between. "I heard you were coming." She had heard those words before. On the road, at the station, from people who had never met her. Eleanor slowly picked up her coins. "Then you already know I need a room." The man looked toward the window, where two townsmen stood near the hitching post pretending not to watch. "I'm afraid I can't rent to you." "Why?" A pause. The man lowered his voice. "Folks around here have questions." Eleanor held his gaze. Questions about what? But he did not answer. He didn't need to. Everyone in Red Hollow knew the story they had decided to believe. 6 months earlier, Eleanor's husband, Samuel Brooks, had died on a winter road outside Missouri. His wagon had gone off the trail during a storm. The official report called it an accident. But accidents were simple. People were not. A widow traveling alone was easier to whisper about than to understand. By the time Eleanor reached Colorado, the truth of what happened mattered less than the rumors that arrived before her. Some said Samuel left behind debts. Some said Eleanor knew more about his death than she admitted. Some simply said a woman alone had no business starting over. Eleanor had learned something during those months. People rarely asked what happened. They asked what they wanted to believe. She took her suitcase and walked back onto the street. The next 3 days passed the same way. A ranch owner needed help until he saw her name. A stable owner needed someone who understood horses until he noticed who she was. A boarding house owner opened the door, saw Eleanor standing there, then quietly closed it after hearing one word. Widow. Eleanor never begged. It was the one thing she refused to give away. She had lost a husband. She had lost a home. She had lost the comfort of being believed. But she had not lost herself. By the 4th morning, the coins in her pocket were almost gone. She sat outside a small livery stable near the end of Main Street, holding her leather bag of tools. Inside were the things she trusted more than people: a small knife, needles, leather strips, herbs wrapped carefully in cloth. Things her hands understood. Things that never judged her. That afternoon, Eleanor decided she would leave Red Hollow before sunset. There were other towns, other roads, another chance somewhere beyond the mountains. She stood, lifted her suitcase, and turned toward the road. Then a sudden crash came from the livery yard. A horse broke loose. Men jumped back as a large bay gelding pulled against its rope, kicking dust into the air. Its eyes were wide. Its breathing came fast. Several cowboys shouted for everyone to stay away. "Get that horse inside before it hurts someone." Nobody moved closer. The animal pulled harder. Eleanor stopped walking. She watched. Not the fear, not the noise, the horse, the way it held one leg, the way its ears moved, the way it kept turning toward the same side. Slowly, Eleanor set down her suitcase. A man nearby noticed, "Mom, you don't want to do that." She didn't answer. She stepped closer. The crowd became quiet. The horse stamped the ground. Eleanor stopped several feet away. She didn't reach for the rope. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at the animal. Then she whispered, "It ain't angry. It's hurting." The words were soft, but someone heard them. A tall man standing behind the crowd, wearing a dark hat and a weathered ranch coat, looked at Eleanor differently from everyone else. He wasn't looking at the widow. He wasn't looking at the rumors. He was looking at the woman who had seen something nobody else noticed. His name was Thomas Hayes. For a moment, the noise of Red Hollow seemed to fade, the shouting men, the nervous horse, the dust moving across the street. Tom Hayes had spent most of his life around animals. He knew the difference between a wild creature and a frightened one. He knew when a horse was fighting and when it was asking for help. Most men saw trouble. Eleanor Brooks saw pain. That was the first thing he remembered about her. Tom stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, his boots pressing into the dirt. "Everyone move back," he said. His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. People listened. The tall cowboy owned a ranch several miles north of town, near the foothills where the pine trees climbed toward the mountains. He was not the richest man in Colorado Territory, and he never tried to be. He had inherited a modest spread from his father and spent years building it into something of his own. A few dozen horses, some cattle, a small crew, and more responsibility than most men ever wanted. Tom looked at Eleanor. "You know horses?" Eleanor glanced at him. Not at his clothes, not at his ranch coat, not at the reputation people carried about him. She studied his eyes. The question was simple. For once, someone was asking about what she could do. "I know enough," she said. Tom looked back at the horse. "Enough to help?" Eleanor didn't answer right away. She walked slowly toward the animal. The crowd became uneasy. A few men whispered that she should let someone else handle it. She ignored them. The horse pulled against the rope again, but Eleanor stopped several feet away. She lowered her hands. No sudden movements, no force. The animal watched her. She noticed the worn leather strap around its chest. The edge was rubbing against the same spot again and again. "Someone tightened this too much," she said. One of the stable hands frowned. "That horse was fine yesterday." Eleanor looked at him. "Yesterday it wasn't hurting yet." Tom watched quietly. She spoke without anger, without trying to prove anyone wrong. She simply knew what she was seeing. After several minutes, the horse allowed her close enough to loosen the strap. The crowd slowly relaxed. The animal's breathing changed. The tension left its body. When Eleanor stepped away, Tom nodded once. "That wasn't luck." "No," she replied. She picked up her suitcase. "It usually isn't." Tom noticed the way she said it, like a person who had spent years knowing the answer and watching people ignore it. Later that afternoon, Tom found her sitting outside the livery stable. Her suitcase rested beside her. The same leather tool bag sat in her lap. She was repairing a torn piece of harness leather with careful, practiced movements. The sun was lowering behind the mountains. Red Hollow was getting colder. Tom stopped a few feet away. "I'm looking for someone who understands horses." Eleanor didn't look up. "I imagine there are plenty of men here who can help you." "Maybe." Tom glanced toward the stable. "Most of them know how to make a horse obey." He paused. "You knew how to make one trust you." The needle stopped moving. For a brief second, Eleanor looked at him. Then she returned to her work. "People say a lot of things about horses," she said. "And people say a lot of things about you." The words hung between them. Eleanor's hands became still. Tom realized immediately that he had touched something he didn't understand. "I don't mean the rumors. Most people do." Her voice was calm. That somehow made it heavier. Tom removed his hat. "My ranch is north of here." "Hayes Ranch." She waited. I need someone who knows how to care for horses properly. I can pay. Eleanor looked toward the road. I'm not looking for charity. I didn't offer any. That answer surprised her. Tom continued, You work, I pay. That's all. For the first time, something in her expression changed. Not trust, not yet. But maybe curiosity. I've heard promises like that before. Tom understood. Not the details, but enough. He didn't ask questions. He simply reached into his coat and pulled out a small folded paper. An address. There's an old cabin on my land. Been empty for years. He placed it on the wooden post beside her. The door locks from inside. Eleanor looked at the paper. Tom added quietly, That matters. The wind moved through the street. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Eleanor folded the paper and placed it beside her tools. I'll think about it. Tom nodded. He didn't ask her to decide. He didn't tell her she should trust him. He simply put his hat back on and walked away. That evening, Eleanor sat alone in the small rented room she had barely managed to afford. The candle beside the bed burned low. Outside, footsteps passed. Every sound made her look toward the door. A laugh from the street, a horse walking by, a wagon wheel rolling over wood. She packed her things before sunrise, not because she trusted Tom Hayes, because she had run out of places to go. The road north was quiet. The mountains grew larger with every mile. Tom's ranch sat beyond a line of cottonwood trees, surrounded by open land and old wooden fences worn smooth by years of wind. He showed her the cabin without ceremony. It was small, simple, but clean. A stone fireplace, a wooden table, a narrow bed, a window facing the mountains, no locked doors from someone else's side, no footsteps inside, no one telling her where she belonged. Tom stood near the doorway. You can use it as long as you need. Eleanor looked at him. What do you want in return? Tom seemed almost confused by the question. Your work. That's all, that's all. The answer was so simple that she didn't know what to do with it. Tom stepped back. Keep the cabin. Then he walked away. That night, Eleanor sat beside the small fire. The cabin was quiet. Too quiet. She kept waiting for something. A knock. A voice. Someone demanding an explanation. But nothing came. Only the sound of burning wood. Only the wind outside. Only her own breathing. Near midnight, Eleanor heard a horse stop outside. Her whole body went still. Her hand moved toward the small knife beside the bed. The door did not open. No footsteps crossed the floor. After several minutes, the horse moved away. When morning came, Eleanor opened the door carefully. A small basket sat on the porch. Bread, coffee, dried meat. No note. No expectation. She looked toward the ranch house in the distance. Tom Hayes was already working near the barn. He never turned around. He never waited for thanks. For the first time in a very long time, Eleanor Brooks sat inside a place that belonged to no one else. And without realizing it, she had taken the first step toward calling it home. The first few mornings at Hayes Ranch were quiet. Eleanor woke before sunrise, the same way she had for years. Old habits stayed longer than people expected. She folded the blanket at the foot of the narrow bed. She cleaned the small iron stove. She boiled water for coffee and listened to the sounds outside. A gate opening, boots crossing the dirt, horses moving in the barn. But this time, those sounds did not belong to someone coming to take something from her. They were simply the sounds of another day beginning. The cabin slowly changed, not because it became bigger, because it became hers. A small jar of dried herbs sat beside the window. Her leather tools rested neatly on the wooden table. A few folded dresses hung from a peg near the door. Nothing expensive, nothing anyone else would notice. But Eleanor noticed. For years, every place she lived had felt temporary. This one did not. At the ranch, Not everyone accepted her immediately. Ethan Cole, the youngest ranch hand, watched her with careful eyes. He was 28, strong from years of working cattle and horses, and he believed most problems could be solved with a good rope and enough patience. One morning, while Eleanor checked a group of young horses near the corral, Ethan leaned against the fence. "You sure you know what you're looking for?" Eleanor glanced at him. "Yes," Ethan waited. She looked back at the horses. That's usually when people stop asking. A small smile almost appeared on his face. Almost, but he shook his head and walked away. The truth was, Eleanor expected doubt. Doubt was familiar. Trust was not. A few days later, the ranch faced a problem even Ethan could not ignore. A valuable mare named Daisy stopped eating. She was one of Tom's best breeding horses, a strong animal that had carried healthy foals for years. The ranch hands tried everything, different feed, different water, more rest. Nothing changed. Tom stood beside the stall that morning, his hat low against the cold wind. "If she doesn't improve, we may have to sell her." Eleanor heard those words from behind him. She stepped closer. "May I look at her?" Tom moved aside. He didn't ask why. He didn't tell her what others had already tried. He simply opened the gate. Eleanor approached the mare slowly. Her hand moved along the horse's neck. She watched, the way Daisy shifted her weight, the way she reacted when the saddle was brought near, the way she avoided turning to one side. Then Eleanor looked at the old leather saddle hanging nearby. "This isn't a sickness," Ethan crossed his arms. "You're sure?" Eleanor removed the saddle and turned it over. "The leather has hardened here." She pointed to a worn section beneath the saddle. "It's pressing against her back every time she moves." The men looked at each other. Tom stepped closer. "You can tell that from looking." Eleanor ran her fingers over the damaged leather. "Sometimes animals tell you everything." She spent the afternoon repairing the saddle, replacing the worn section, softening the leather, adjusting the fit. 3 days later, Daisy was walking normally again. A week later, she was running with the other horses. No celebration, no grand announcement. Just a quiet morning when Tom found Eleanor fixing another piece of tack outside the cabin. He stood there for a moment, then removed his hat. "I was wrong about what I needed." Eleanor looked up. Tom continued, "I thought I needed someone who could handle horses." He glanced toward the pasture. "I needed someone who knew what they were seeing." For a moment, Eleanor didn't know what to say. Compliments had always come with a price before. This one didn't. She simply nodded. "Thank you." And Tom walked away. That was how their friendship began, not with promises, not with grand gestures, with small moments that repeated until they meant something. Tom would come to the cabin with a broken fence hinge or a question about a horse. He always stopped at the door. Never inside. Never past the threshold. Eleanor noticed. The first few times she wondered if he was simply being polite. After a while she realized it was something deeper. He respected the space she had fought to create. One evening, rain moved across the valley and turned the ranch road into mud. Tom arrived at the cabin carrying a repaired lantern. "You left this near the barn." Eleanor looked at it. "I thought Ethan fixed it," he tried. A small smile crossed her face. "Did he make it worse?" Tom looked toward the darkening sky. "I wouldn't say worse." A pause. "I would say different." For the first time in months, Eleanor laughed. It was quiet, almost surprised. But Tom heard it, and for a moment, neither of them looked away. Then the sound of thunder rolled over the mountains, and the moment passed. Weeks went by. The people who once refused to speak to Eleanor began bringing horses to Hayes Ranch. They stopped calling her by rumors. They started calling her by her name. But the hardest change was not the town. It was inside the cabin. One night, Eleanor woke suddenly. The storm outside was heavy. The wind pushed against the walls. A branch struck the side of the cabin. For a second, she was somewhere else. Back in another room, another life, waiting for a sound she never wanted to hear again. She sat up, breathing slowly. Then she heard something different. Not a door opening, not footsteps approaching. Only rain, only wind, only the old cabin standing exactly where it had always stood. The next morning, Tom found her repairing a leather strap near the barn. "You look tired." Eleanor almost said she was fine. The old answer, the automatic answer. Instead, she paused. "Bad dreams." Tom nodded. He didn't ask about them. That was what made it easier. He simply handed her a cup of coffee. Black. No sugar. She looked at the cup. "You remembered." Tom shrugged. Wasn't hard. But Eleanor knew it was. Remembering small things meant someone had been paying attention, and she was not used to being noticed without being judged. That afternoon, she walked back toward this cabin carrying the empty cup. For the first time, she did not feel like she was staying there. She felt like she belonged. But sometimes the moment a person finally finds peace is the moment the past decides to come looking. And Eleanor Brooks had no idea that someone from the life she left behind was already heading toward Hayes Ranch. The morning began like any other. The sun rose slowly over the Colorado mountains, spreading pale gold light across the pasture. Frost still clung to the wooden fence rails, and the horses moved quietly through the mist. Eleanor stood near the barn, checking a young mare's leg while Ethan held the lead rope. Months earlier, Ethan would have questioned every decision she made. Now, he simply watched and learned. "You were right about Daisy," he said. Eleanor looked up. "That sounds painful for you to admit." A small grin appeared on Ethan's face, more than breaking a saddle. She smiled slightly. It was a small moment. The kind of moment she once thought she would never have again. A place where people knew her name before they knew her story. Then a rider appeared at the end of the ranch road. The horse was tired, the rider was not. He sat straight in the saddle, wearing a dark coat and carrying a leather folder under one arm. Tom noticed him from the barn. His expression changed before he even knew why. Some people arrived carrying supplies. Others arrived carrying trouble. This man carried both. His name was Walter Briggs. Eleanor saw him from across the yard, and for the first time in months, the calm in her face disappeared. Not fear, recognition. Walter removed his hat. "Eleanor." The way he said her name felt like a reminder of something she had spent a long time trying to leave behind. Tom stepped closer, not in front of her, beside her. Walter looked between them. "I see you've settled in." Eleanor said nothing. Walter glanced toward the cabin near the trees. "So this is where you've been hiding?" Tom's voice remained steady. "She's not hiding." Walter smiled faintly. "I didn't say she was, but everyone heard what he meant." That evening, Walter stayed in town instead of leaving. By morning, the old whispers returned. They moved through Red Hollow faster than the wind. Some people who had started greeting Eleanor now became quiet again. The past had a way of making people remember the worst version of someone. Walter went straight to the local office and produced old papers. He claimed Samuel's property still belonged to the Brooks family. He claimed Eleanor had no right to the money left after her husband's death. And most importantly, he claimed she had taken something that did not belong to her. The same people who once doubted her now watched to see what would happen. Grace Whitmore heard the rumors at her small cafe. She poured coffee into a tin cup and looked across the room at the men talking near the stove. "They waited months to see her fail," Grace said quietly. The customer looked at her. "You believe her now?" Grace looked toward the window, where Eleanor walked past with a basket of supplies. I believe people should have asked questions before deciding they already knew the answers. It was the first time anyone in town had said it out loud, but Walter was not finished. 2 days later, he arrived at Hayes Ranch with a legal notice. The paper was folded neatly, the kind of paper that could make people nervous before they even read the words. Tom stood near the barn. Eleanor stood beside him. Walter looked at the cabin. That place belonged to no one when you arrived. Eleanor held his gaze. No, her voice was calm. It belonged to Tom. Walter smiled. And now you think it belongs to you. Before Eleanor could answer, Tom stepped forward. The cabin is hers to use. Walter looked at him. You're willing to throw away family property for a woman you barely know. Tom's jaw tightened, but he did not raise his voice. You don't know what she's earned. The words stayed there, simple, clear. Walter looked back at Eleanor. You always had a way of finding someone to stand beside you. For a moment, the old Eleanor might have lowered her eyes, the woman who had left Missouri with a suitcase and nowhere to go. But she was not that woman anymore. She stepped toward the cabin, the same cabin where she had once sat alone, waiting for someone to take the little piece she had found. She placed her hand on the door. This door locks from the inside, she said. Walter frowned. What does that matter? Eleanor looked at him. Everything. The yard became silent. The wind moved through the trees, then Walter reached for the handle. Tom moved immediately. With anger, not with force, just one step. That door belongs to her. Walter stopped, and for the first time he realized something had changed. Eleanor was no longer asking permission to exist. She was standing in a place she had built, a place she had earned, a place she would not surrender. Then another sound came from the road. A wagon. An older man stepped down carrying a leather briefcase. Judge William Parker. The entire ranch seemed to hold its breath. He walked toward Eleanor slowly. Mrs. Brooks. She looked at him. I believe it is time you knew what your husband left behind. Walter's face changed, just slightly, but Tom noticed, and so did Eleanor. The judge opened the briefcase. Inside was a sealed envelope, old, carefully preserved. Samuel Brooks came to me 3 days before his death, Judge Parker said. The wind moved across the ranch. Nobody spoke. He was not running from debt. He looked at Walter. He was gathering evidence. Eleanor's hand tightened around the cabin door. The judge opened the envelope. Samuel discovered that someone had been taking money from his transport business for years. Walter stepped back. That's a lie. But his voice was different now, less certain. Judge Parker continued. Your husband intended to report it. Eleanor stared at the papers. The man she lost, the man everyone believed she had betrayed, had been trying to protect the truth. And then came the words she never expected to hear. Samuel sent these documents away before he died. The judge looked at her. He sent them to someone he trusted. A long silence followed. Eleanor whispered, Who? Judge Parker reached into the envelope. Then he placed the papers in her hands. You. The world seemed to stop for a moment. Eleanor looked down at the handwriting. Samuel's handwriting. A part of a life she thought was already gone. She had no idea. All this time. The proof that could clear her name had been waiting for her. And the man who had destroyed her reputation had been hiding the truth. Walter Briggs had not come to reclaim the past. He had come because he was afraid the past was finally catching up with him. And standing beside the cabin door, Eleanor Brooks realized something important. The woman who arrived in Red Hollow with nothing had finally found the one thing nobody could take away. Her own voice. For a long time, Eleanor Brooks simply stood there holding the papers Judge William Parker had placed in her hands. The ranch was quiet. Even the horses seemed to sense that something had changed. The pages were old, the ink slightly faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable, Samuel. Her fingers moved carefully across the paper, not because she doubted it, because she remembered the hand that had written it. The same hand that used to leave notes beside the stove when he went out early. The same hand that once repaired broken wagon parts late into the night. A part of her had spent months wondering if she had misunderstood the man she married. If maybe the rumors were right. If maybe everyone else had seen something she had not. But now, standing beside the cabin that had become her refuge, Eleanor finally understood something. The truth had been waiting. It had simply taken time to reach her. Walter Briggs tried to speak. "This doesn't prove anything." Judge Parker looked at him calmly. "It proves enough." The judge explained that Samuel had kept detailed records of the missing funds from the transport business. Receipts, payment ledgers, names. Walter had spent years hiding losses and moving blame onto others. When Samuel discovered what was happening, he had planned to bring the information forward, but he never got the chance. Walter's face hardened. The confidence he arrived with was gone. For once, he was the one standing in front of people who knew the truth. Not Eleanor. The sheriff from Red Hollow arrived the following morning. Walter did not leave in handcuffs with a crowd cheering. Life in the West was rarely that simple. He left quietly under the weight of his own choices, and that was enough. For Eleanor, the victory was not seeing Walter fall. It was no longer having to carry what he had placed on her shoulders. The days afterward felt strangely ordinary. That surprised her. She expected some great moment, some feeling that the world had completely changed. Instead, she woke before sunrise, made coffee, fed the horses, and repaired leather straps at the same wooden table. The cabin still creaked when the wind moved through the trees. The roof still needed work near the back corner. The floorboards still made a sound near the fireplace. But now, those imperfections felt like home. People in Red Hollow slowly changed too. Not everyone apologized. Some people never did. But Grace Whitmore came to the ranch one afternoon carrying a basket of fresh bread. She stood outside the cabin door. "I brought too much," Grace said. Eleanor looked at the basket. "You always bring too much?" Grace smiled. "Only when I have something I don't know how to say." Eleanor waited. Grace looked down for a moment. "I should have asked you the truth before believing what everyone else said." The silence between them lasted several seconds. Then Eleanor nodded. That would have meant a lot back then. Grace accepted the answer. Not as forgiveness, not yet, but as a beginning. Weeks passed. The ranch returned to its normal rhythm. Ethan became the first person to ask Eleanor for advice without hesitation. The same man who once doubted her now brought injured horses to her before anyone else, Tom noticed. But he never acted like he had created that change. He knew better. Eleanor had built it herself. One evening, as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, Tom found her outside the cabin repairing an old bridle. The leather was worn, the stitching was loose, but Eleanor's hands moved with patience. "You're fixing that again?" Tom asked. She looked up. "It still has life left." Tom smiled. "I suppose that's something you understand." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. There was something different between them now, not because the past was gone, the past never truly disappeared, but because they were no longer letting it decide what came next. A few weeks later, Tom prepared to leave with a group of horses headed south, only for a short trip, a few weeks. Business required it. He packed quietly, the way he did everything, no dramatic promises, no words he wasn't certain he could keep. Before leaving, he stopped at the cabin. Eleanor noticed something immediately. He wasn't carrying a saddle, he wasn't carrying tools. He had no excuse to be there. Tom stood near the doorway, the same doorway where he had stood months earlier and told her the cabin was hers. "I wanted to talk before I leave." Eleanor set down the piece of leather in her hands. "All right." Tom looked around the cabin, at the table, the tools, the small shelves Eleanor had built herself. Then he looked back at her. "When I gave you this place, I did it because you needed somewhere nobody could take from you." A breeze moved through the trees outside. Tom reached into his coat. For a moment, Eleanor thought he had brought papers, and he had. But they were not what she expected. A deed with her name on it. "I had the ownership transferred." Eleanor stared at the document. "Tom, you keep it." She looked up. "Why?" His answer came simply. "Because if I ever ask you for something, I want to know you're choosing it freely." The words stayed between them. Tom stepped back from the door. "I'm not asking you to leave this place." A pause. "I'm asking if there is room in your life for me." Eleanor looked around the cabin, the place that once represented survival, the place where she first learned what quiet felt like, the place where she discovered she could stand alone. Then she looked at Tom, the man who never tried to own her, the man who waited outside the door until she invited him in. She remembered the first night, the fear, the silence, the question she had carried for so long. Could a person ever feel safe again? Now she knew the answer. Slowly, Eleanor walked toward him, not because she had nowhere else to go, because she wanted to. "I spent years being someone's wife before I was allowed to be myself." Tom listened. He always listened. Eleanor continued. "I won't disappear into another person's life." Tom nodded. "I wouldn't ask you to." A small smile touched her face. "If I share your name, Tom," she paused, "it will be because I choose to." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Tom smiled. Not the smile of a man who had won something, the smile of a man who had been given something. They married in the spring, nothing extravagant, no grand celebration that people would talk about for years, just friends, ranch hands, and a small gathering beneath the Colorado sky. Eleanor Brooks remained Eleanor Brooks. Her name stayed on the work she created. Her hands remained her own. Her cabin remained hers, and beside that life, she chose Thomas Hayes, not because she needed saving, not because she needed a place to belong, but because she had finally found a person who made belonging feel like a choice. Years later, people in Red Hollow still told the story of the woman they once judged too quickly, the widow who arrived carrying a small suitcase, the woman who was given a cabin and rebuilt her life from the inside out, and the cowboy who never asked her to become smaller so she could stand beside him. He simply stood there and waited until she chose to stand beside him. And maybe that was the greatest gift Thomas Hayes ever gave Eleanor Brooks. Not a cabin, not a ranch, not even a promise. He gave her the space to become herself again. Imagine carrying a name that people whispered about before they ever knew your heart. Imagine walking into a town where your past arrives before you do, and every door feels like it might close. Then imagine finding one person who does not ask you to prove your worth before offering you kindness. That was Eleanor's journey. She learned that healing does not always come from forgetting what happened. Sometimes it comes from finally finding a place where the past no longer controls the future. And sometimes love is not someone saving you from the storm. Sometimes love is the person who stands beside you while you discover you were strong enough to survive it all along. If you had been in Eleanor's place, would you have been able to trust again after everything she endured? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd truly love to hear your story, and if stories of courage, second chances, and unforgettable love from the old American frontier speak to your heart, consider subscribing and joining us. There are many more heartfelt journeys, hidden truths, and healing moments waiting for you in the stories ahead.